Okay, guys, welcome to day 2 of CDK Live. We are so excited to be with you this morning. Today, we're going to talk about F&I in the dealership. And I have with me Brent Coggins, who is our Director of Product in the modern retail space, and Jason Swick, who is our Manager of Product Marketing for modern retail as well. And my name's Anu Roberts. I'm the Senior Director for CDK of modern retail. So, in our session, we're going to talk a little bit about the trends that we're seeing with the consumers and expectations, as well as the importance of trust and education on the consumer as well that the dealership needs to take, and then also exploring some of the impact of technology on streamlining the process and really personalizing the F&I process. So, Jason, I want to start with you. There is, I think, no debate about the importance that the F&I role is in the dealership. And we'll get into that a little bit more. But before we get into that, I want to highlight a study that CDK did around F&I in the dealership. And before we dive in, why was it important for us to do this study?
Yeah, absolutely. So, we did the friction point study, and that was really the entire front end. But we really wanted to delve into what does car shoppers think of the actual F&I process? How important it is to them? Who do they trust in the dealership? So we really looked at 1,200 car shoppers, focused on that trust. What do they think of the F&I process overall? And most importantly, we wanted the research to be helpful to our dealers so they can actually affect change and change their processes based on what we found.
That's great. It's talking about the friction points. We know in that friction point study, in fact, we just released our fourth annual edition just in time for NADA. But the consumers are still struggling with some of the friction points. We've done a lot of, and we've seen a lot of improvements in the sales process. And one area, the second biggest area of challenge for consumers, is around F&I and some of the points around there. So, in regards to trends and expectations, Jason, what are you seeing in the F&I office, currently?
Yeah, so let's start off with the good news, right? We found that 84% of car shoppers actually trust um, or think that the F&I process was a great one, somewhat or extremely satisfied with the F&I process. And probably more importantly than that, 65% of them thought that the F&I manager was the most trustworthy, even above the salesperson. So that's the good side of it. The challenge still lies with the time, right? 37% of our car shoppers are still taking more than 30 minutes just to get into the F&I process. And if you look at it, they get in there, they have to go through the product presentation, it takes longer. And think about who the last person they deal with at a dealership is. It's the F&I process. So if they're going and doing a CSI survey, that's where their last experience was, and that can really lower that CSI score.
Yeah, and just think about, I was just thinking like there's such an emotional element. You're excited, you finally got through the negotiations, which that's a big, that's a lot of the process is in that negotiations, and you finally get to F&I and you just want to drive your car.
Right.
And then, so really closing in on that gap, that focus area is so critical. So, Brent, let's talk about trust and building
Right.
trust with the consumer. What do you see is some of the biggest challenges around the F&I process and building trust?
Well, we know that putting consumers in the box has never been a good process. It doesn't breed consumer trust. While an effective sales method, it leads to a lot of dissatisfaction. We see it in all the surveys that people don't like that, just like you just mentioned. I thought I purchased this car already, and now I'm being presented with a whole new sales process. So transparency, flexibility, personalization are all key to success in the F&I office. We don't have to surrender the lucrative uh, selling that we can do in the F&I office, but there's a more collaborative way to go about it. So that means personalization, so presenting the consumer items that work for them in their particular situation. It's dynamic menus. It's a fluid presentation. It's one that's customizable and personalizable by the consumer themselves, and not simply the old days of a paper menu slid across the desk with a number of static options.
Yeah. So, Jason, what about we talked about trust? What about the role of just educating? Brent mentioned transparency as well. How does that play in the education piece into helping build that trust?
It goes hand in hand. So, Brent mentioned about that older way of thinking of going into the box and selling. It was always effective, but we know that bringing that product education forward is a huge piece to building that trust, not only with F&I, but with the salespeople and increasing that overall. Um, we also see a 15% bump in sales when you do that. Now, what I will tell you is you don't want to just bring it forward and let a salesperson say, hey, these are options, right? We need to make sure everyone's trained, educated internally, so they can actually educate the customer as well.
And we have
So,
found, and much to my surprise, consumers will self-select F&I products, right? Which I found to be surprising. But
Yeah.
if presented early in the sales process, if given a good description, perhaps some ancillary materials, videos, or other materials to read about the products, we have found they will actually self-select F&I products.
Yeah, and you mentioned the other thing, right? You gave that example of I'm excited, I want to get out on the road with my car,
Right.
and the last thing I want to do is, negotiate for something else that I just spent an hour negotiating for, or something more than that. So bringing that forward is going to decrease that frustration with the customer. They'll know those products, even if they don't select something. At least they know about it before they get in the office.
Yeah. So let's talk about technology, because we've certainly here at NADA we hear a lot about the great things that are happening around streamlining the process and improving the process. Let's talk about how technology can help in the F&I space. And so, Brent, if I can ask you, how do you see technology improving and streamlining and really helping with personalization, particularly in the
Right.
F&I process?
And the most obvious answer there is electronic menus, right? So the paper menus of old are still in wide use, but we have a number of electronic menu options these days. So that gives the consumer the ability to configure their deal, to move elements around, to see the effect on the payment. Oh, perhaps I don't want the tire and wheel. If I just move that over, what's the effect on the payment? It's a more dramatic presentation. It can also be done off-site, right? So you can complete the F&I process remotely. You can send a consumer a remote menu and have them in the comfort of their own home at their own leisure, read through these options, look at the materials, think about it, and not feel that they're in a high-pressure situation.
Yeah, and I think it's about flexibility too, right?
Right.
Giving the customer flexibility, the dealership flexibility on how they want to work with the customer. So you have that remote piece, but you also have the in-store piece, right? If I want to walk out to a desk and introduce myself and start the process, I can do that with those flexible options.
Yeah, I think that's so key, especially, I mean, we just hear so much about that personalized online or in-store, and just being able to, like you said, Jason, just offer the options to the dealer and the consumer of just however they want. Let's serve it up to them however they want. I think that's so critical. So, Jason, the other trend we've been hearing a lot with our dealers is this notion of a single point of contact in their sales process. So, what advice would you offer everybody in the industry about, how that equates from an F&I perspective in the modern retail workflow?
Yeah, so I think it's a big topic because a lot of people want to have that experience for the customer to stay with one person throughout the entire workflow, which is a great experience for the customer. But what I would tell them to look at is there's usually a reason why there's these veterans in the F&I office, right? They know the products, they know how to discuss them with the customer. So what we see from dealerships who really do well in this area is they have somebody helping that salesperson behind the scenes, really teaching them, going back to personalization. Talking to them about, hey, show this to the customer. This is what they bought 2 years ago. They're going to want the vehicle service contract, or they're going to want tire and wheel, or they have this kind of car. So not just handing it over to that single point, but really guiding them along, but still giving that experience to the customer at the end of the day.
So while the consumer might experience a single point of contact, there's actually perhaps even an army behind that
Right.
sales agent that's helping them and guiding them and directing the sale for them.
Yeah, just streamlining it sort of
Right.
behind the scenes
Right.
and enabling and equipping the sales team.
F&I is a
or
very
whoever,
complex
right?
space, right? So the reason why it's not a single point of sale type of thing is that it's very complex, and the selling of F&I products is very complex. Some of these really need to be have the value proposition explained fully to the consumer before they'll understand, why tire and wheel or fabric protection or something like that might be of interest to them.
Yeah.
Well, and it's also, the e-contracting side of it too. The selling of the products is important from the revenue perspective, but compliance perspective, having that army behind them, making it smoother, working with a lender to get the right deal, all of those things are important to take that burden off that single point.
Yeah, really good point. Especially as you mentioned earlier about just the fact that, consumers really trust the F&I person
Right.
that they're dealing with,
Yeah.
and so we want to make sure to, that's a big bonus and benefit for the dealer.
Well, typically that's a no-nonsense person that
Right.
clearly knows the subject
Yeah.
matter and just rattles through things.
Yeah.
So it just breeds trust. This
Yeah.
person clearly knows what he or she is doing. So,
Right. Right.
And I think dealerships who really want to go down this road, they have to have an understanding that out of the gate, they might drop in profit a little bit on that F&I side. But if they stick with it and they educate their internal folks, it will breed a better workflow overall. But they got to stick with it and then really educate both sides.
Right.
we
Right.
found a mixed approach has been the most effective. So that's early education or even presentation, the option to self-select. So in a digital retail environment, let the consumer self-select if they like, and then followed up by a formal presentation or just a supplementary presentation. If done gracefully, it doesn't have to seem like a high-pressure sales interaction, but
Right.
will be as effective as it was in the past, while leaving the consumer feeling that they participated, they chose, and they walked away with exactly what they wanted.
Yeah.
That's a good point. So, Brent, we've been hearing a lot today, well, this whole weekend about AI.
Right.
So, talk to me a little bit about where you see. I mean, you just had mentioned, F&I is complicated.
Mhm.
It's not easy, and there's a reason why.
Right.
There's a lot of compliance. There's just a lot of complexity around that. So how does AI? How do you feel that AI is going to fit in and help in the F&I space?
Well, you can't walk 10 feet in the show without seeing something about AI.
Right.
It's clearly at the front of mind for everybody. AI is not a new technology, but it's relatively new to our space. So here at CDK, what we've done is embedded it into our existing solutions. So we're not forcing our dealers to learn a new product. This is an aid within the existing product set. So our CRM has a new sales assist. Our CDK service has a service assist. But we also have some behind-the-scenes AI elements as well, such as the predictive presentation of forms. So perhaps you don't have that veteran F&I manager sitting at the desk today. That's okay. We've got AI now that can help show that whoever's managing the F&I station, which forms are likely to be needed in this deal. So you've got this lender, this deal parameter, you've got a co-buyer, you've got a trade. Typically, here are the forms presented. So in the past, you had to generate the forms list and manually select them, or reach in the drawer and pull out the paper forms. Now we can use AI to say, hey, we think you should print these forms based on the deal that you've sent us.
Well, and I'll also add on, we talked about that mixed approach and having that army behind the scenes. We don't want to come off as saying that you have to have all these resources and pay
Right.
more money as a dealership. But that's where AI can come into play, right? The education of menu products, that's going to be one-to-one. But from an AI perspective, we can do things that just looks at how you work today to make it easier for that user. So predictive forms helps that single point of contact, takes that burden away from that behind the scenes person to generate the forms. And they can focus on the other things that are more complex that has to have that human intervention right now.
Right. That's great. So, Jason, as we wrap up our conversation this morning, what are some of the key takeaways that you want to leave our dealers with around the F&I process and what they should be thinking about as they start looking forward in 2024?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is transparency really breeds trust.
Yeah.
Right? Having the product education in the very beginning, even if you're not going to single point, right? Most of our dealers aren't. So if you have that salesperson at least conversing with the customer, getting them prepared with what these products are so that when they get in the F&I office, they're not caught off guard. They're not thinking that this is just a pitch to add on more money for the dealership or something like that. So that transparency builds that trust. And I do think technology, using modern retail technology is going to build that trust, increase that customer satisfaction, and really, we think, drive success overall.
Yeah, that's great. Brent, do you have anything to add?
Well, not only does it lead to a better consumer experience, we have seen the FTC and other regulatory bodies recently take an interest in the F&I process, specifically around what are perceived as junk products or junk fees. So transparency, like Jason said, will avert any issues there. But it's also a best practice. It's really
Right.
what the consumers deserve and want, and will lead to long-term, more satisfied consumers.
Yeah. Well, it's been an interesting discussion. It sounds like the F&I role at the dealership is just firmly, it's such an important role, but it's nice to see how, things like trust and transparency and pulling that menu forward and the education process, both obviously from the consumer side, but also, Jason, as you mentioned, on the sales side is so important in really helping that consumer experience and giving them the information that they want up front And then also you touched on the, the flexibility, which I love, that however they wanted on the consumer side, online in store, just that flexibility, which is really great. And then just hearing a little bit about some of the tech, to helping to streamline the process, and looking forward to seeing more around AI in the F&I space. So
Much more to come on AI. We're just scratching the surface.
that's great. That's great. Well, thank you guys. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.